Over 1.5 million refugees have already fled Ukraine since the start of the military conflict, and more than 360 civilians have been killed, according to the United Nations. The International Committee of the Red Cross, or ICRC, said a devastating humanitarian crisis is unfolding. What's the situation on the ground, and what has the ICRC been doing to assist victims of the crisis? What's life been like for residents in eastern Ukraine over the past 8 years? Last Friday, I talked to Robert Mardini, Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, who joined me from Geneva, Switzerland. I'm pleased to be joined by Robert Mardini, Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, joining us from Geneva, Switzerland. Mr. Mardini, thank you very much for joining us. So the situation in Ukraine has been escalating. First, please tell us, what do you know about the current situation in terms of humanitarian needs there, and what kind of relief work the organization has been doing, and what is being stepped up?
Well, thank you for having me. In just 1 week, we are seeing really devastating humanitarian crisis unfold in Ukraine and the surrounding countries. Casualty figures keep rising while health facilities struggle to cope. We are receiving a flood of calls from people desperate for safety. People are sheltering underground, often for hours on end, and are not able to go outside for fear of shelling. Many Ukrainians today have no water, no electricity, and poor phone connectivity. Food and basic necessities are hard to find. We have heard from many people who were wounded and are looking for assistance, including persons who feel in great psychological distress, and who are asking for really mental health support. Hundreds of thousands of people also, as we all know now, are fleeing into neighboring countries, traumatized and with only what they can carry.
How big is your team on the ground, and where roughly they are operating? I mean, I understand over the past 8 years you already have been present in the eastern part of the country since 2014. Tell us a bit about that, and now that the situation is has dramatically escalated, what is the additional member of staff that you're putting in?
Indeed, the ICRC has been present in Ukraine over the past 8 years to deal with the humanitarian consequences of an existing conflict in the east, in the Donbas region. So we already had a significant team in Ukraine, 600 colleagues in different cities. But of course now, with the mounting humanitarian needs, we definitely need to beef up and scale up our presence, our logistical supplies in the country in order to match the humanitarian disaster. So for instance, the situation in Mariupol is deteriorating. Our team told us that people are fleeing with whatever they can carry, sometimes even with their pajamas. And it's really incredibly distressing. Our team in Mariupol has been working to help wherever they can. This included distributing food, water, and hygiene items to close to 4,000 people living in shelters. We also delivered first aid kits and medical supplies to care for trauma injuries at different hospitals and medical facilities in the city. In Kyiv, we provided medical supplies to treat trauma wounds to 2 of the main hospitals in the city. Of course, we are doing this working hand in hand with our partner, the Ukrainian Red Cross Society. And as we speak, we are deploying additional staff and supplies to the region so we can really scale up our response. Some additional colleagues, including those who can support with the medical needs and distribution of food and relief supplies, arrived in Ukraine as well this week. And this is a continuous effort.
Right. Well, Thursday, delegations from Ukraine and Russia agreed to pave humanitarian corridors for civilians. What does this result mean for the Red Cross work on the ground?
Well, look, any initiative that gives civilians a respite from violence is something that we welcome at ICRC. So this is, I think this is good. We need to see how this is implemented in concrete terms, and it really means that there is at all times a consensus by parties that this safe passage remains to stay safe, and also with the understanding that outside those safe passages, we cannot be in a situation that anything goes. I mean, the basic rules of war, international humanitarian law applies everywhere in Ukraine. And this body of law is here to protect civilians in harm's way, because let's not forget that many people in armed conflict cannot flee, cannot leave. The elderly, people with disabilities will certainly stay. So parties to the conflict, and this has been our consistent call to all parties, they need to take every precautions to protect civilians and to spare civilians from direct attacks.
One of the very important jobs of the Red Cross across the world is to protect the rights. Even wars have rules, as you very well know, under the Geneva Convention, for instance. According to your observation, because there have been casualties on both sides, hundreds, even thousands wounded, hundreds killed, are these rules recognized internationally being observed on the ground to the people who are engaged in the fighting, I mean, from the government troops on both sides?
Well, this is really part and parcel of the observation we raise bilaterally, confidentially with parties to the conflict. We are monitoring this very carefully at ICRC, and we are really reminding parties to take every measure to protect civilians, to alleviate human suffering through a strict respect of the rules of war. This includes, of course, making the distinction between military targets, civilians, and civilian infrastructure. This means also that according to international humanitarian law, parties to the conflict have the obligation to give access to the prisoners of war that they hold, and that re-establishing family links during the conflict is also an important feature that the ICRC works on to make sure that families get back in touch.
I mean, at this moment, have you gotten credible reports that there is any maltreatment or abuse of prisoners of war on either side in this conflict?
Well, so far we were not in a position to visit any detainees in connection with the current conflict. This is an effort that is underway. We hope that we will be able to do so, and we will certainly raise any observation with the respective party to the conflict.
How about the foreign volunteers or people under whatever individual capacities, whether paid or not, whether they are volunteering to fight, to join the Ukrainian people to fight, and some of them encouraged by their national governments, they are entering Ukraine. What kind of international law is there to protect their rights and safety?
Well, when civilians take weapons and fight, they lose the protection afforded to them according to international humanitarian law, and they become legitimate targets. This is part of the of international humanitarian law. Civilians are protected with the understanding that they are civilians and they are not taking part in the hostilities. That's the basic understanding that needs to be clarified here.
So there is actually a considerable risk for anybody who wishes to join, any individuals who wishes to join the conflict on their individual basis. But I want to still focus on the humanitarian disaster, because the UNHCR, the UN Office on Humanitarian Affairs, have said that this could lead to Europe's largest refugee crisis this century, and that 1 million refugees have already fled Ukraine. What concerns you the most about these numbers, and what kind of support is there to help countries neighboring Ukraine deal with the influx?
No, indeed, we're seeing important movement of civilians. Well, internally first, there is a great deal of people internally displaced, and people are also crossing the borders into neighboring countries. The figures are soaring, and as Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, we launched an appeal to step up our operations inside Ukraine to help people in Ukraine, but also connecting with our Red Cross Red Crescent partners in neighboring countries. There is a component to help national Red Cross, Red Crescent societies deal with the humanitarian needs in neighboring countries. So this is a comprehensive response, but I think I cannot emphasize enough the fact that the situation should remain, despite the conflict, livable for people inside Ukraine. This is a large country. It cannot be emptied from its civilians, and parties to the conflict have the obligation to make it livable for ordinary Ukrainians today. That's it.
Right. Extremely important messages there. We hope more people will hear that. I do want to know about the kind of support your organization is getting for doing this very important job at this critical moment. For instance, in terms of funding, how do you estimate, and is there a gap? Because whenever you have a mounting humanitarian situation, there is always a big gap of funding. Are you calling for donations? And if so, have you any responses yet?
No, this is an important point indeed, and we came up with a budget extension appeal to be able to step up our response, and that was really met by a great deal of solidarity. We are getting lots of support from donors, be them state, private. So far, I would say the money is not the bottleneck. The bottleneck is the intensity of the fighting, the logistical hurdles, the difficulties that first Ukrainians are facing, the civilian population is facing, but also humanitarian agencies are facing into getting in the country and mounting meaningful response operations. So we are all hands on deck, trying to do everything we can to support when we can and to step up the response going forward. Now, depending on how the conflict develops, of course, much more funding and support will be needed, and we hope that we will be able to count on the same level of solidarity and generosity from our donors.
Thank you so much, Robert Mardini, Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, joining us from Geneva.